In Hollow Knight Silksong, the primary story path wants the player to explore the map to find 5 different bell shrines, unlocking the grand gate in the Blasted Steppes to enter the Citadel and begin Act 2. But in your travels around Farloom, you may have wandered into a semi-hidden backdoor route into the giant evil bug castle called the Mist. The Mist is an area puzzle of the kind made famous by the Zelda franchise's iconic Lost Woods. Rooms link to each other in a twisting and repetitive way, and you have to find some sort of clues to lead you onto the correct path. If you enter the Mist blindly, you might find yourself running in circles, or looking up solutions online, or... In order to solve the maze, you need to play the needle-in for little groups of moths found in each room, which will lead you to the correct door. Repeat this enough times while avoiding hazards, bottomless pits, random traps, and evil ghosts who want you dead, and you're out. Simple, right? But what if you want to do all of that fast? Let's just get a couple things out of the way. This video is meant to be a speedrunning resource, so I won't be covering things from a casual play angle, or going in-depth on non-practical edge cases. This also matters because the speedrun enters the Mist from Sinner's Road rather than from Bilewater, which has an impact on how you exit the maze. Sinner's always exits to the right, and Bilewater to the left. But we don't care about Bilewater. Second, everything that will be discussed is based on practical testing and using basic debug tools to view a few variables which manage how the maze functions. There's no deep analysis of the game code involved here. Lastly, this is some real nerd shit. I'll be attempting to cover all of the important mechanics of the Mist in pretty exhaustive detail. A companion document is linked in the description below, which goes over most of the same information. If you just want to know the what and not the why, use the timestamps to go to a section on applied strategy that gives you the basics. Just be aware that you may be missing out on some nuances which are important for getting really good at the on-the-fly decision making which you need to clear the maze quickly under pressure in a variety of contexts. There are 8 rooms which can appear in the Mist as part of the actual puzzle, plus a midpoint room and a final exit hallway. In the files, the 8 puzzle rooms are called Dust Maze 1 through Dust Maze 8, and the midpoint room is Dust Maze Crossing. We call these rooms M1 through M8, and just Crossing for brevity and clarity. That way we can separate talking about the different possible rooms from, say, what room you're at in the maze sequence. So, for example, your first room, or Room 1, can be any of the M1 through M8 rooms. When you enter the maze, you are placed into a room completely at random, except for room M7, since you enter from the right and that room doesn't have a door on that side. Each room has between 3 and 5 loading triggers which connect it to the next random room, which we call exits. Any of these that you didn't just enter from is considered a valid exit. When you enter a room, one of these valid exits, which again does not include the one you came from, is randomly chosen and marked as correct. If you play the needle in for the moss, that's the one they'll lead you to. Solving a room means that you take the correct exit and move on to the next room, which is once again chosen at random from the remaining 7 rooms in the pool. All of the other exits count as incorrect, and taking an incorrect exit completely resets your progress in the maze. If you die, or void out by falling down a pit, you also reset your progress. The basic win condition for exiting the maze is that you solve 3 rooms, enter the crossing, and then solve 2 more rooms to reach the final exit hallway. Along the way, you have to avoid randomly spawned traps and find where the moths have appeared in each room so that you can play the needle in and find the correct exit. After the first room of the maze, hostile wraiths also spawn in each room, with more and more appearing as you progress. Obviously, there's a lot of randomness involved here, but what makes it complicated enough for a whole video? And how do we make this not a gigantic, slow headache in a speedrun? Let's talk about score. While in the Mist, the game tracks several values which monitor the player's progress through the maze. These values dictate when the player can enter the crossing, and when they can complete the maze and then exit to the exhaust organ and onwards to the Citadel. First, we have correct left, which is the number of correct exits which the player still needs to take in order to complete the maze. Taking correct exits reduces this value by 1, and taking an incorrect exit resets it to the default value of 7. There are some exceptions, but we'll talk about those later. Next, we've got incorrect left, which is the number of strikes the player has for taking incorrect exits with a default value of 3. Taking incorrect exits reduces this by 1. If this value reaches 0, the player is booted to the Mist entrance upon taking an incorrect left or right exit. Needed correct is the game's benchmark for setting the starting value of correct left, and it represents the threshold for how many rooms we need to solve. Total correct is the running tally for the number of correct exits which the player has taken. Taking correct exits increments this value by 1. Taking an incorrect exit resets it to 0, meaning your progress on the maze has also been reset. Just like correct left, there are some exceptions here, but we'll get to those. This is the most important value for our purposes, and we call it your score. There are a couple of other values dealing with the maze which are also tracked, but they're less important. For the sake of being thorough, here's a quick summary of these. Feel free to pause if you're interested, or just read the doc link in the description. In order to reach the crossing, you need to have a score of 2. For the maze to be considered complete, correct left must be at 0 and your score must be at least 7. Fortunately for us, we actually get a couple of freebies along the way, which is where those exceptions I mentioned before come into play. Each time you take a correct exit, you get 1 point of score, but entering the crossing is an exception and grants you an extra point. So when you're in your third room, you have a score of 2, and then when you solve that room, you get a point to make your score 3. Then, under most circumstances, you get an extra point of score during the room transition as you enter the crossing. When you walk across the hallway and leave through the other side, you get another point, so you come up with a score of 5. The whole time you're gaining points, you're also lowering the countdown of correct left, so by the time you leave the crossing, that value is sitting at 2, which means you just need to solve the puzzle 2 more times and you'll end up in that final exit hallway and you get to leave the maze. The bonus point you get in the crossing exists because of a few elements of the maze's design. The crossing is a linear, horizontal hallway, so in order for it to make physical sense for Hornet to be there, you have to enter it from the left or the right. Because of that, the correct solution to your third room will always be a left or right exit in order to correctly transition into the crossing. Similarly, the exit hallway is set up so that Hornet has to enter it from the left and walk through it to the right, so the solution to your final room will always be to the right. This physical sense rule for the crossing and the exit has some strategic applications, but we'll talk about those later as well. We run into an issue here though with room M7. This room only has one side exit and it's on the left. That means if the puzzle solution in your second room takes you to the right and you end up in here, you can't get a correct exit to the side which leads to the crossing. That means your solution will be up or down, and then you have to do an extra room before you get to the crossing. If this situation happens, the bonus point isn't granted, because the player got extra score before even reaching the crossing. That way, when you move on past the midway point in this scenario, the game equalizes your maze progress to all other scenarios by leaving you at a score of 5 and a correct left value of 2 as a sort of bad luck protection. This extra room issue created by M7 also means that if it's your final room, no matter what door you come in through, you can't properly exit to the right to finish the maze. In that situation, you have to reach a state where you do have a usable right side exit, which results in having to do at least one extra room. If M7 is your last room and you entered it from the top or bottom, and the moths lead you out the left side, you would have to do even more extra rooms to escape the maze if you didn't end up in either M5 or M8, which have 2 right side exits. In those cases, you could just navigate around to whichever right side exit you didn't come in through, but you're rolling the dice otherwise. Even if your final room isn't M7, if you enter it from the right, you're still in a similar situation since, again, you have to find a valid right side solution to get out. You're probably thinking that this sounds like an absolute nightmare for a speedrun, and that the story route through the Grand Gate has got to be way better. But there's one thing about the scoring system which actually mitigates these issues by quite a lot. If you solve a room and take the correct exit, you can just walk right back through the door into the room you just left, and there's no change to either your score or to the value of correct left. This probably exists so that the maze doesn't reset your progress if you were to walk through that door by accident, preventing extra frustration for casual playthroughs. Totally makes sense. But it gets better. When you walk back into an already solved room like this, the game acts like it's your first time there and rolls a new correct exit for you. That means you can solve the room again and get a point of score again. Have you ever wanted to learn how to juggle? This quirk of the scoring system means you can solve a room not once, not twice, but virtually as many times in a row as you want. Once your score is 2, you'll still end up going to the crossing, but if you wanted to, you could immediately double back and continue re-rolling that same room until you've met the conditions to complete the maze. Solving a room multiple times like this is called juggling. If you want to juggle one room for the whole maze, there is another strange quirk where immediately doubling back out of the crossing without passing all the way through it removes the usual bonus score, so you have to solve the room one extra time for the completion. That means juggling a single room the entire time is usually slower, but if you're really comfortable with that room, it can be safer and more consistent. Juggling rooms is extremely effective because you don't have to quickly identify a new room every time, you just have to know how to navigate whichever room you're going to be using. As an extra bonus, the moths which will show you the next correct exit all stay in the same positions, so you don't have to go looking for those either. You will still get increasing wraith spawns as you go, but that bit's unavoidable. At least the traps don't get entirely re-randomized. Even without juggling a room multiple times, being able to double back like this without a penalty to your score allows you to completely avoid the extra room issues mentioned before. If you get into a sticky situation, going back to your previous room often solves the problem. The most common application of juggling a room goes like this. You enter the maze, and your first room is one that you like because it's fast or it's familiar enough, whatever. You want to keep it, so you decide, okay, I'm going to juggle this. Or maybe you didn't like the first room, but the second is good, so you juggle that. You find some moths, you take your correct exit, and then you head right back into that first room again. Since you know where the moths are, you can head straight there, play a quick tune, get another solve, and then repeat that process however many times you need to in order to reach the crossing. After the crossing, you just need to solve one more room, and then either take a right side exit in your 6th and final room, or go back to whatever you had for room 5 and do the same thing there. If you get a situation like this, where the crossing spits you out into a short room like M6 from the right, you might decide right away that you'll do a quick juggle to leave, without even considering whatever your 6th room might have been. But wait a sec, how would you know that you don't even have to consider your 6th room there? And why would you just run to the right automatically? Don't you have to serenade some moths? If you've been paying attention, you might be ahead of me here, but the answer has to do with that physical sense rule I mentioned earlier. While maze rooms are selected at random, there are still a couple of obvious limitations which are grounded in the physical layout of each room and what would make sense in the world of the game. First off, a room can't lead into itself. It's a weird maze, but it's not that weird. Secondly, if you go out of a room to the left, you necessarily have to enter the next room from the right. No teleporting shenanigans involved here. This also means that if you leave a room through a doorway that leads up, you can only end up in rooms that have a corresponding exit on the bottom. Same deal for top exits. As mentioned before, we take advantage of this for the crossing and the final hallway, both of which are flat and have to be entered from a side exit. In the case of the crossing, it can be either a left or a right, but for the final hallway, it must be accessed from a right side exit. No exceptions. This simplifies things for us quite a bit. If you're keeping count of your score, you'll know that your 3rd room can have a correct exit to the left or right to get to the crossing, and your final room solution will always be a right side exit. In the case of that final right side exit, you can just make a beeline straight for it in most rooms, but M5 and M8 each have 2 right side exits. If you didn't come through the other right side door, you'll still have to find some moss to figure out which exit is the correct one. But the crossing isn't just nice enough to give us bonus score, it also doesn't care at all how we get there. When you're in your 3rd room, the correct exit to reach the crossing is actually any and all available side exits, left or right. The moths will lead you to a specific one if you let them, but you can even have a situation where you could go to any of 3 doors and still correctly progress to the crossing. For example, entering any room with multiple side exits from the top or bottom means you can take your pick. In this example, I enter M3 from the top, and with the help of the debug tool, we can see that I have multiple options. Since I'm familiar with the room, I know that it's fast for me to go to the right, so I just pick that one, but I could have done any of the 3. Let's summarize. The basic game plan for quickly completing the Mist is basically complete 2 rooms to get a score of 2, either by juggling a room or just solving the puzzle twice normally. In your 3rd room, take any valid left or right exit to reach the crossing. Run through the crossing, solve your 5th room, and in your final room, whether you chose to proceed or to redo your 5th room, take a valid right side exit. If this room only has one right side exit, then going through that will always complete the maze. If you're in M5 or M8, the only rooms with 2 right side exits, you'll have to play the needle in to know which of the 2 is correct. The only exception here is that if you enter either of these rooms from one of the 2 right side exits, then the remaining right side exit is guaranteed to work. The actual pathfinding involved in doing this is pretty straightforward once you take some time to familiarize yourself with the various room layouts. There's a link in the description to a folder with full resolution maps of each room which you can use to study. The biggest obstacles, and the reason the Mist is challenging in the first place, are having to locate moss to figure out correct exits and dealing with the wraiths that spawn as you progress. Handling that comes with practice, but here's a quick breakdown. Each room has a pool of possible spawn points for moths, and they will randomly populate some portion of those. The amount of this varies from room to room. Some rooms end up being trickier than others due to variance between the total possible spawns and the number of actual spawns. For example, M1 only has 3 potential moth spawns and it fills 2 of them. They're also in a straight line across the room, so it's not too tricky to find the moths you need. M4, on the other hand, has a whopping 7 possible spawns, and it only fills 3 of those. They often end up pretty spread out, and the room is already big and fairly dangerous to navigate, so finding moths here can really suck sometimes. Just like the moths, each room has a pool of possible spawn points for wraiths as well, which also get filled randomly. However, the number of wraiths which can spawn depends on the player's score. The upper and lower ends of how many wraiths can be in a room varies, but your first room will never have any. There can be up to 2 wraiths in your second room, up to 3 in the third, 4 in the first room past the crossing, and up to 5 from that point onwards. The wraiths will start to spawn even if you take an incorrect exit in the first room, but they still correlate to your score, so if you fail at any point in the maze, no more than 2 will spawn on the reset. The wraiths are a huge pain in the ass, and you want to avoid them whenever you can. However, they aren't immortal, and it's generally a good idea to kill a wraith that's coming between you and any moth that you might need. If you have to fight more than one, you're losing a lot of time, so part of good decision making in the Mist is understanding when to completely avoid trying to reach a moth spawn that's just too dangerous to bother with. Killing wraiths is fairly straightforward once you get used to it. Just lure them in for an attack, jump, and counterattack either with a pogo or a slash. They die in 6 nail hits or 2 nail hits plus a silk spear. I recommend the spear for the sake of your timer and your sanity. It is also possible to pacify wraiths with the needle in if you play for long enough, which is probably a mechanic that Team Cherry added for lore reasons and as a failsafe, so that players who are a split second away from triggering a moth solution don't have to bail out just because they're about to get snatched. The problem is that wraiths often attack from far away before they even get close enough to be pacified, and after you stop playing, they just attack you anyway. If you find yourself in this situation, just be ready to fight as soon as you stop using the needle in, but in general I recommend against relying on this strat. Maps showing the possible moth and wraith spawns for each room are in the same folder linked in the description. Alright, welcome to the part of the video where I start saying things like probably and should a bunch. I'm about to go over what I personally believe are ways to make the Mist more cooperative, mostly based around the physical sense rule and some anecdotal evidence regarding moth spawns and stuff like that. To be clear, I am not a top Silksong runner, and I'm making this video very early after the game's release. There will probably be more discoveries that enhance or invalidate a lot of what we've already covered, and a lot of what I'm going to suggest in this section is pretty subjective. That said, it's my video and I'll do what I want. Also, I'm right. First off, I believe that in pretty much all cases you should try to enter the crossing from the right, meaning you'll enter room 5 from the right side as well. One benefit of this approach is that you cannot get M7 as your 5th room, which means that even if you get it as your final room, you always are able to double back immediately. Not just that, but it'll be a room with a valid right side exit, since that's how you got there in the first place. You do run the risk of this 5th room being either M5 or M8, where you have to needle in for your solution in the end, but that issue exists no matter how you do the crossing. Secondly, and this is certainly subjective, there are some rooms that I think you should almost always try to juggle, and some you should pretty much always try to avoid. Each room has between 3 and 5 exits, so in general rooms with 3 exits are desirable because they tend to be smaller and therefore easier to navigate and manage via juggling. The 3 exit rooms are M1, M6, and M7. We've already talked about why M7 is tricky. It has no right side exit for later in the maze, which also makes it impossible to get as your first room. That said, if you get it as your second room, it's good to juggle because it is very small and fast to navigate if you can set up a left exit to the crossing. M1 is versatile since it has exits to the left, top, and right, and only 3 potential moth spawns, but it's pretty wide and it does have a lot of wraiths. M6 is the best of both worlds. It's pretty small, mostly flat and easy to navigate, and only spawns 3 wraiths at the very most. The only downside is that it has 4 moth spawns, which it only populates 2 of, and you might end up in a situation where moths spawn on the complete opposite end from where you come into the room. Still, I think this is the best room to juggle out of the entire set, regardless of when you get it. On the other end of the spectrum, some rooms just suck real bad. The notable outlier is M4. It has a large void zone, a big section of spikes, various other hazards, and a ton of moth spawn variants. It also has 2 up exits and a down exit, increasing the likelihood of getting a map like M7. The rest of the rooms are mostly up to personal preference, but some are quite large, like M2 and M3. M2 is a giant box, and M3 is enormous vertically, but in some contexts they're still quick to navigate, mostly when you're moving top to bottom. M5 and M8 are counterparts in having the double right exit problem, but M5 is likely worse because it's larger and a bit harder to navigate. Optimizing your movement through any given room is heavily context dependent. In cases where your exit is guaranteed, like with the crossing or the final hallway, rooms that are otherwise annoying become very quick. A great example is if you enter M3 from the right side and your next room will be the crossing, you can run right to left faster than pretty much any other similar scenario. However, in a different situation where your exit is not guaranteed and you enter M3 from the bottom left, you might have to do a lot of annoying climbing to exit out of the top if that's your solution. Complicated decision-making trees like this are what I think makes this part of the game so interesting to dig into, but this video is long enough already, so I'll save little optimizations like those for a future guide. I'll leave you with one piece of tech which, while optimal, probably won't come into play for a long time, even for the top of the leaderboard. The only situation in which you should make a blind guess in the Mist. Yes, it's okay to make a blind guess. In one specific situation. No, blind guessing the entire maze as a requirement to get world record will never happen. If I'm wrong and it does, the category will probably be dead for other reasons. Anyway, here's where it could be good. In the very first room of the Mist, the music is pretty quiet and the pipe organ in the soundtrack is pretty subtle. When you solve the room, the music changes a bit and the pipe organ becomes more present. In theory, you could use this music cue to see if a blind room 1 guess is correct, which could save somewhere in the neighborhood of about 10 seconds. Getting the guess wrong would only lose you 1 room, again, a swing of about 10 seconds. This could be cataclysmic and destroy any percent forever, depending on who you ask. Don't ask them about bad patterns on Trobio, though. If you made it this far, thanks for putting up with my little obsession. It only took a handful of hours to do this research, and I had a lot of fun with it. Special thanks to Kazakai and the Hollow Knight Speedrun Discord for providing the debug tools I used for much of this work. Thanks also to Staxis for providing early testing and the entry reference images in the written doc, and to various other runners like Magma, Blue, and Vesper for testing my ideas and proposing some of their own. Shout out to Blue in particular for the music cue thing. Now go learn how to speedrun Silksong and have fun.